We have the pleasure to have Athina Karatzogianni with us, and she will give a talk on the relation between ideological forms and the leadership in the social movements, using the work of Rosa Luxemburg. And yeah, and then the discussion will follow. So thank you, Athina. And yeah.
Thank you for the invitation. And thank you, the Rosa Luxemburg Institute. Thank you for coming today. I know it's been a very difficult week here in Athens. Although I recognize it is an event with a capital E, what has happened in Athens this week, I will not. We can try in the discussion, but I think it is too early to analyze it. I suppose, and possibly an opportunism for me to analyze it. So I'm going to stick mostly to what I was going to talk about to begin with. So, because I know that not everyone necessarily knows about Rosa Luxemburg and her legacy, I would like to begin very quickly saying a few words about this and how I understand her legacy. So the first thing to say is that Rosa Luxemburg benefited from a great network across several countries because of her family background, and some credit that support network with her drive to change the world. She was greatly supported. So the second thing that I want to say is that there are historical and corresponding, but not always, political intense and conflictual phases in her legacy, which is 100 years old or more legacy. And it is a fluctuating, her legacy, a political problem to this day. So briefly, I would say that there are those that think that the comrade and revolutionary Rosa is different from the theorist Rosa, the intellectual scholar Rosa in that sense, and that she's a shining example for communists around the world, but also full of errors, deviation, wrong political judgment, and abomination of heresy, with Luxemburgism presented as a false doctrine, the same as Trotskyism, and so on. And most people actually understand this latter view as the dominant one. However, a more complex matrix is at work here. Rosa Luxemburg, Liebknecht, and others in Spartacus, which later became the KPD, stood as real communists in Germany, with Rosa as the equivalent of Lenin, and their communism always in comparison and competition to the Russian one, as the successful one, the Russian one, and theirs, Rosa's a failure. A failure because the Socialist Party prevailed, and with their compliance, in fact, Rosa Luxemburg was murdered, hit savagely, shot, her body thrown over a bridge by the Freikorps. And you can hopefully see here two key tensions: the antagonism with Russian communism and the antagonism inside Germany with others of the left. Another point is that from the moment she died, she was an heirloom in her own party, the KPD, and there were fights, of course, and conflicts between different factions to claim that legacy. And because of these conflicts, even Lenin famously had to intervene in these debates, saying that Rosa was an eagle, sometimes flying as low as a chicken, making the error judgments, etc., but the chickens can never reach the heights of an eagle, that she was an eagle. And he called chickens, of course, those that attempted to demolish her legacy inside the KPD, particularly Ruth Fischer, for those who know, probably, hopefully know what I'm talking about. And after Lenin, Stalin, of course, went for interpretation, which was more or less, and I'm being nice, Rosa the revolutionary hero, but no to anything, they rejected anything related to her theoretical work. And particularly, Luxemburgism was seen as another fallacy, heresy, and equivalent to Trotskyism. So you can understand that after Stalin died, of course, the East Germans, I mean, there was, Cold War and so on, idolized Rosa in East Germany as a key revolutionary figure of German communism. So I'm saying this very briefly just to say that my interest in this, outside her life and her work, is more, rather, my interest is theoretical in her scholarship rather than in all this legacy. I find something that is very useful. And particularly taking off from Cahill, who writes that Rosa Luxemburg's thought makes a clear, and I'm quoting, break with the prevailing effort to subsume resistance under the paradigm of consciousness. Her eminent materialism refused to accept the distinction between the episodic spontaneity of resistance and the constant self-correcting presence of revolutionary consciousness. So he writes, Cahill writes, in a deliberate inversion of Lenin's privileging of consciousness, Luxemburg claimed the movement was reversed, consciousness followed the movement, a metamorphosis of resistance, it did not direct it. Now that is the element that interests me. And in that sense, the idea is that any revolutionary effort leaves traces, and there's waves of resistance leaving traces of its passage in the sand, changing the environment for future struggle. And in her own words, Luxemburg writes, the working conditions of ceaseless economic struggle with the capitalists keep their fighting energy alive in every political interval, and so on. Now, why is this interesting? Because although we know a lot about ideology, of course, there's like hundreds of books, and we know that it has structural effectivity in organizing collective human activity. What we don't know currently, and this is why it is relevant for those studying digital movements, digital activist movements, digital politics, and so on, we don't know enough about ideology and digital temporalities within varieties of capitalism, because there are many, and so on. So because ideologization, the process of how we become ideological, how we make ideology, how we ourselves in our life world decide what is our ideology, let's say, the process of being in the world, understanding, so the subject, how it sees itself within time and space, experiencing, materializing political consciousness, is formed by interactive political, socioeconomic, and historic conditions. And this process of ideologization defines a collective political unconscious. Now, in that sense, the argument we're making in a book that hopefully will be out by the end of this year with Jacob Matthews at Paris State University, is that because we don't know enough about what's happening with temporality because of the digital transformation that we're experiencing, we don't know enough about how leadership is transformed. So the idea, Rosa Luxemburg's idea about spontaneity and that consciousness follows the movement, it does not direct the movement, is particularly relevant today. So I'm going to take you through in little lovely steps, hopefully, and not tiring, hopefully, some concepts that could potentially help perhaps explain in the future other digital movement organizations, So I'm going to talk about ideologization, temporality, leadership in social movements, the influence of organizational structure, and the bipolar process on leadership formation in movements. Now, if we're talking about, and I'm going to talk about briefly here, because I know some of you probably have no interest whatsoever in the more traditional political theory kind of aspects of this, so but I need to explain ideologization as a process. So being in the world, articulating political consciousness. So the historic materialist perspective is, of course, that this is formed by interacting political, social, historical conditions, right? So in that sense, if you think about the tradition from Merleau-Ponty, the subject sees itself within time. Marx and the consciousness determined by historical-economic factors. Then you have Althusser ideology as a lived relation and a response to the demands of the condition of existence. Then I'm going to talk a bit about Gabel and false consciousness taking on from Lukács as a reification or rejection of the dialectic. And also the question of how far does the class concerned perform the actions history has imposed on it, consciously or unconsciously. And lastly, I'm going to rely, as I'm hopefully explained, on Luxemburg's understanding that consciousness follows the movement and the metamorphosis of resistance that does not direct it, which is a notion clearly against Lenin's revolutionary consciousness. So, when we talk about ideologization, we're talking about mediations, shifting, the mediations between shifting material conditions of production and particularly individual and collective processes of ideologization, which radical leadership incarnated, affected, or significantly contributed to on a scope spreading beyond the bounds of the core political groups themselves. So the transformation of this ideologization impacts the degree to which the ideology emerges, when and how it emerges in human consciousness in the algorithmic age. This is where we are now. How this consciousness communicates and organizes, the level of accuracy and detail it communicates, to which structures, under which conditions, then impacts on formal ideological consciousness at the individual collective level, and therefore impacts on how leadership emerges as fractalized. So my argument with my co-author is that leadership emerges fractalized due to new multiple divergent temporalities, the structural organization of digital networks, the organizational structure of movements, and the biolabour processes mediating them. So, okay, in that sense, you have theorizing temporalities of leadership between the 1960s, the late 1960s, and the present days in juxtaposition. That's what the book does empirically by looking at the late 60s and contemporary movements like, such as Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter, the recent ones, and empirical work. We have done interviews with activists from these movements. So there is like this, what we want to demonstrate, and I'm not going to talk about the empirical part of the work here, but we can discuss it in the questions. We want to demonstrate the role of ideologization, the emergence of fractal leadership in contemporary movements operating on digital networks. So, okay. So a few explanations on concepts, consciousness, okay? So you have the beautiful Nietzschean consciousness is language worn out of speech that no longer tells the truth, that there is a distortion. Of course, the Freudian, the mind is the enemy, the unconscious distorts thinking, and then the Darwinist, Darwin understood consciousness as a biological predetermined. Althusser does not view consciousness as central because he writes that ideology has very little to do with consciousness. Althusser talks about ideology as above all structures that impose on us, not via consciousness, and that it is both a real and imaginary lived relation between subjects and the condition of existence. Now, there's a real, there's an imaginary lived relation. I would argue that there is also now another relation that has to do with how we interact with the digital, with digitality as well, beyond the real and imaginary. You could say virtual, but then we will get a bit confused because we have to explain the less, and I don't want to do that here and bore everybody. Now, temporality. So temporality is central to this idealization process that I hope I gave you an idea, because it can illuminate this subject catching sight of itself within time, but also it clarifies subjectivity, particularly when this subjectivity and being in the world with 4.6 billion users online is now digital by default. So temporalities can be conflicting, they can be colonized For example, we have imperial temporality, temporal inequality, racial time. Whole populations can be temporarily excluded, desynchronized, while macro-temporal boundaries may be blurring, disappearing altogether. For example, in digital labor processes or the biolabour process that I'm going to talk about in a minute, where you have the centrality of time and space shifting in shaping that labor process. Now, in all this, there is the issue of false consciousness as described by Lukács, and you have this combination where he argues that discovering the historical function of class consciousness is a combination of objective economic totality, of course, but at the same time, he states that the essence of scientific Marxism consists in the realization that the real modes of history are independent of man's psychological consciousness of them. So there's a contradiction in the heart, in the heart of this, which is the classical agents versus structures discussions of Giddens, the whole thing happening there that we don't have time for. Now, back to Rosa, you have the traces of historical consciousness that we're interested in, because they can illuminate how human consciousness operates within this ideologization process I'm describing. And for this, I'm going to turn to Gabel the original French is 1962, but then the English one, 1978, where he published a book called False Consciousness, an essay on reification. Now, Gabel views false consciousness as a diffuse state of mind, with ideology as a theoretical crystallization of a general justificatory nature, a derivation. So becoming conscious of world and history within this ideological unconsciousness, the subject forms a lived relation with the world, it acquires political consciousness. Now, is ideologization a process that is homogeneous in nature and function, or we can discern different levels in it? So Gabel says that false consciousness and ideology are two aspects of reification or rejection of the dialectic, again, reificational rejection of a dialectic. So now, to begin with, Gabel says that how the mind works, it has to be schizophrenic. It is a schizophrenic phenomenon because it has a reificational structure. So how are you to say, okay, in simpler terms, when Zizek talks about attaching the symbolic order, right, it's like how you do this reification process, and in the sense that false consciousness involves this reification of interhuman relationships and the specialization of historical duration. This is because false consciousness relies on specialization, and it is an anti-dialectical experience, where there's a crisis of temporalization in the psychological perception. So now, why this can become interesting is because the specialization of the past might produce far-right ideologies, while a crisis in dialectical temporalization of the historical utopian future produces far-left ideologies, with a lost temporalization. Of course, he combines with clinical alienation and describes this. Now, political alienation itself is a form of schizophrenic structure. So here there's a mechanism of egocentric formation of political concepts, and also a spatiotemporal structure that comes from the world of false consciousness. It means that if you do the relation to the past, that is sort of the right or far right or whatever. If it's in the future, it's utopia. Now, there is a disagreement there. Of course, you could say, well, if you do it in the future because you have this more futuristic Nazi scenario of the future and so on. But the idea is that how you reify and attach, and you do this, you have like this. In the past, the more conservative right, far right. In the future, the more utopian left. That is his idea. Now, from then on, what becomes interesting, and I'm going to leave it there, I'm going to pick it up again later, going back to capitalism's durability and so on, there's some very interesting work by Tieber arguing that the key is not ideology, actually, right? Which is what I've been saying. But certain facts about the class structure itself. So his argument is that it is not culture, socialization, but the coordination of material interests which is important in the stabilization of capitalism. Workers are persuaded to accept the system as legitimate, not by dint of ideology, he writes, but because of how it aligns with their well-being. So, in that sense, class formation occurs when workers seek out collective strategies to defend their well-being, forcing workers to resist as individuals, not through collective action. Okay? Moving on. Now, the second problem of relevance here, after the Tibber point about the individual and collective, that I'm going to deal with my problems, right, as an individual, not through the collective, right? The second problem of relevance to the ideologization process is identified by Lordon, and it's fundamental to this discussion about the historical evolution of leadership, because it is about collective action. Collective action, though, as an obstacle to class formation. So Lordon uses this, of course, this notion of imperium to talk about this. And he says that there's this tiresome activist opposition of verticals and horizontals. That's a long debate that is raging, especially since the 90s and the globalization movement, about vertical movement organization as juxtaposed to horizontals. And he talks about it as a faded echo of the historical contention between authoritarian and libertarian socialists in the more sophisticated terrain. And then you have this story about basically that the tension between horizontal and vertical, this rejected notion of the certain, the vertical returns back, that has been rejected, of course, in the 60s, and I'm going to talk about these notions of leadership, decentralized, participatory, feminist, and all sorts of leadership that has to be horizontalized, and this obsession with the horizontal. And he writes here, the vertical returns with a vengeance. It reappears through the window. Firstly, to address the problem of coordinating the activities necessary for material production, but above all, to deal with the question of violence. So here, then, hopefully, I'm going to get to, it's a little bit like a Lego puzzle. We're going to put things together. So I try to kind of lay out some, and connect some dots between human consciousness, temporality, the lived, imagined, virtual, digital relation to structures, historical, political class, false consciousness. All of them are elements I'm getting to of an ideologization process which can be ongoing at the individual collective levels, and which we argue fundamentally that it influences leadership. Now, this is all good because within a little time we have been through the very boring theoretical stuff, and now we can get to the digital and the pandemic a little bit, because the same problematic, the relationship between ideologization and leadership, becomes more complicated because the digitalization of economic, sociopolitical, cultural behaviors and processes in societies around the world has taken a quantum leap during the pandemic. So responses to the global health emergency have catalyzed the adoption of digital technologies for several years. So what would have happened in 10 years happened in 3 months, and so on. And of course, it highlighted the strengths of our abilities in how people use these technologies, how people's behavior differs across digital environments, and the trade-offs in relation to accessing services, exploiting digital opportunities, safeguarding data protection, mitigating against algorithmic bias, as well as democratizing demand to grow inclusion and equality within this highly accelerated context. The problem is that this discussion is more is restrictive because the idea is that if you regulate this, then it's going to become democratic, and so on and so forth. Now, digital technology has been, of course, changing the way people mobilize in politics. I have done some work on this, and many of my colleagues have, how they engage in economic activities, potentially affected decision-making, the nudging, reproducing, creating new hierarchies, social inequalities, and so on. And however, you have this recovery in techno-utopians that thought that digital technology will be a force of good in the world and fueling these demands for democratization, social change, environmental justice. But this, in fact, culminated in isolated public spheres dominated by surveillance capitalism, business models relying on polarization, disinformation, viral architectures vis-a-vis government, international organizations, all struggling to regulate and implement policies in order to mitigate the harmful effects of rampant digitization and so on. So this is about like mitigating, regulating, right? Now, on digital politics, the digitization of politics, and of course economics, the convergences, right? It poses challenges to under kind of state it. We know, yes, that digital networks, and I'm deliberately using that term, offer an alternative means of inclusion, right? In democratic and authoritarian societies through coordinating, organizing, and essentially amplifying an event. Initiating civic activities, but with a debatable impact on voting and campaigning. And explain why it is debatable today, this as well. So, however, what happens is that, yes, this is all true, but sustaining long-term impact is always in question. Day-to-day use does not necessarily result in a longer sustained political participation among citizens. And although digital technology may enhance civic engagement and political identity, online participation does not indicate the intention to participate offline. So to see many people online, it doesn't mean that they're going to go out in the street necessarily. And in fact, we don't know what it takes to go from digital materialization of movement organization to real-life physical mobilization. We don't know that. We cannot measure it. So, moreover, power hierarchies and divisions in socioeconomic status leads to digital divide, echo chambers, filter bubbles, misinformation, trolling, thereby affecting online deliberation because it renders it regressive or disruptive of democratic action. And that is the kind of, let's say, the state of the scholarship there. The critique in the scholarship is that, there is a boom in scholarship on what people talk about as surveillance capitalism, platform capitalism. I'm not going to give the references here, particularly impact of network media, platform economics on political economic life. And then you have the historical development of state funding for surveillance technologies, for military intelligence policing by political governance purposes, social impact, and so on. Now, despite this empowerment of social movements and participation in social media networks, the reality is that it promotes individualized politics. And these individual politics are geared towards self-communication, self-expression, more than collective action. So it's having a limited impact on political engagement, other than this indirect impact on citizen self-expression. And in addition to that, corporate platform governance is more important a disempowering voice and visibility for civil society actors. I know civil society is a problematic term, but we don't have time for this, than any state strategy aiming at terminating movements through policing. So it is the corporate governance that has more impact in disempowering voice than the state strategy through policing. So going back to the regulator rather than, and then you can fill in the gap yourselves, the deliberation and mobilization of individual groups and organizations to combat social and other inequalities, right, is stifled. So regardless of extensive efforts to demonstrate the devastating impact of unfettered digital innovation, for example, in relation to datafication. Okay. είναι τα go, είναι τι είναι, ωραίο. Sorry, so regardless of these efforts to demonstrating the devastating impact of unfettered digital innovation in relation to datafication and platform governance, the quantification of subjects and social relations, political polarization, populist disinformation, and so on, the theoretical development, and this is hopefully we're going to arrive here, the theoretical development regarding this milieu tends to be too specialized and preoccupied as to whether these processes can be regulated, reformed, better implemented to mitigate the negative impact of the technology because it enhances various techniques of human and increasingly non-human ecologies. By that, I not only mean non-human in terms of animals, plants, etc., but also machines. Okay. So the concept of temporal networks and why temporality and the change that the digital brings to temporality is because you have a combination of different time rhythms through predictive technology to develop a time economy that can generate revenue. So what you get is working, time, leisure, dualism, battle over temporal sovereignty, the creation of multi-temporalities, as I said before, racial, imperial temporality, and so on. So to give you an example, during the pandemic, we had the suspension of time, the witnesses of affective temporalities of grieving, the loss of a future, kids with the climate anxiety, and we argue a transformation. What I argue here is that you have a transformation of the perception of temporality because of where you are and how you're mediated. So as we saw so far in theoretical argumentation, temporality is central for the ideologization process. Therefore, a transformation of temporality has a direct impact on ideologization, and then that means that in turn, it transforms any notion of leadership. So you have a change in temporality, which is centered on ideologization. Then you have direct impact on notions of leadership, because leadership happens in an individual collective level through ideologization. So, okay, so meanwhile, the other problem we've got is that already in the last 30 years, we have problematics in relation to digital networks, which point to the philosophical, structural, organizational, labor, ideological order issues of where, from the local, national and global or post-national level, how this order of descent is articulated at the different levels, and what this digital transformation of ideologization actually involves. So, okay, in terms of leadership now, I have to say something about that. So in the 1970s and 80s, feminists mostly rejected charismatic leadership in favor of shared leadership, rightly so, in which what you have here is more like nurture emotional support, dispersed among members of a group, that the feminist groups also took leaderless forms. Leadership was also seen as a dirty word, as it was associated with hierarchy, patriarchal domination, and then you have moves moves towards a more participatory democratic model, and this model influencing other social movements. So in this kind of more open, decentralized, horizontal, shared, participatory leadership model, there was also this aversion to permanent leaders. So, for example, in the 80s, you have this distributed leadership in the feminist movement, and also sort of this kind of like model of opening up and so on. However, there was criticism for example, from the environmental movement in particular, that women's search for an inclusive, collaborative approach to leadership was undermined by social expectations of a more directive leadership style. And then you have, moving on, this more polycentric idea about polycentric movements, hierarchic movements, that the leaders are not hierarchically arranged. You have multiple centers of power and leadership, and in the sense that leaders present themselves as first among equals or coming up from the grassroots. So in that sense, what was going on there, sometimes you have these traveling evangelists that were misperceived as leaders. That might be just carrying information or build relationships or whatever, but they were seen as leaders. And then you had movements that insisted on, and I will give the very famous example, Subcomandante Marcos, because Comandante is the people. Or Ada Colau in Barcelona, that did not want to be seen as a leader of the eviction movement. So there's this emphasis that about this kind of idea. Then you have the noughties or the 2000s, and you have these hierarchical versus dispersed networks or networked organizations versus organized networks. So the network forms, this whole thing about this network form, that is a structural challenge to the logic of hierarchy, and it prefigures a world to come, free of hierarchical forms. And the idea then, I mean, we're talking about now about 20 years ago, is that you have movements that come together for an event, say in the globalization movement in Genoa, and they disperse again. People were talking at that time, 20 years ago, about rhizomatic structures using the Deleuzian theory. So the idea is that the movements, such as in Genoa, Melbourne, you know, the materialization of the globalization movement, can take action without the need of a leader and without an individual having a privilege in sight. They're able to conceptualize the characteristics of the whole. And these events, protest summits, they have this coalition building, so they come together, they disperse, And they were organized to target an event, right? And they move more as networks rather than as hierarchies. But this view, and it was, and in my view, a naive view, and I have been naive as well, but this view of networks as decentralized swarms, right, and then that links, of course, with the revolution military affairs and the Rand Corporation theories regarding swarms and so on. But the important point is that you have the persistence of crypto-hierarchies in these networks. So, for example, in the open source movement, the role of conflict, self-organization, that they play this role in emerging structures of leadership. So it is necessary, there cannot be a structuralessness, a leaderlessness. Nothing can work like that, basically, because it masks power. Leaderless masks power. You have these crypto-hierarchies in different levels of coordination, identity, strategy, because this negotiation happens there, right? So you cannot have this idea of horizontality, and I'm going to get back to it. And the result was in the late 1990s and early 2000s that you had this leaderless mobilization that became common with decentralized systems, invisible, unaccountable organizers, a focus on this coalition building, right? And then you have this new wave of theories of autonomous social movements. The decline of state power, of course, initially benefited these affinity groups and autonomous networks, but also reactive networks. And by that I mean active and reactive in the sense of active and reactive desire, or active and reactive affective structures. And in the sense of reactive networks, we talk about the Islamic insurgency, the far right, or capitalist-linked extraction gangs in other parts of the world. So you have this also identitarian spectacle there happening. Now, the anti-leadership story because you have people theorizing the Occupy movement. The Occupy movement, of course, was the Occupy Wall Street. The Occupy movement was an abstract assemblage with concrete assemblages all over the world and so on. And the idea, coming back to leadership, there was this anti-leadership perspective where which has a number, of course, of sources: anarchist, ecological, feminist, and other ideological position against this top-down power, concerns about the neutralization of social movement through the elimination of leaders, right? Concerns that leaders will be recuperated into non-radical politics and so on. So, a little bit about this horizontalism as a plague of the left. That is a quote from Roger Hallam, co-founder of the Extinction Rebellion, which we interviewed for a European project that we're doing called Digiden at some point in the last couple of years. And I wanted to say that I hope that there will be a recording of this, because he is now in jail and he was refused bail. He's been in jail, I think, since November. He was in January, refused bail. Roger Hallam is one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion, and for causing public nuisance, the judge said that you're going to keep doing this. He was refused bail for his actions as an Extinction Rebellion revolutionary, as he wants to he talks about himself as a revolutionary, not an activist deliberately. Now, a plague of the left, and why he's talking about like this, because there was this, as I described it, from the 60s onwards, but also if you look at this charismatic leadership, right, that was going on with Podemos in Spain, or with other kind of leaders of the institutional left later on, that this is charismatic leadership, right? For example, you have this optimism about counter-hegemonic leadership. I mean, you read people writing about reimagining counter-hegemonic politics and anti-hierarchical horizontal movements. This is the moment of this, but people, even the people that write to this day, this kind of analysis that they're combating the asymmetries of power, right? They still recognize that you have the problem of how this decentralization, this horizontal participatory story is actually applied, and the misapplication. For example, a leader of the Black Lives Matter movement writes about the misapplication of decentralized leadership and the fact that you cannot intervene. You cannot intervene, do decision-making very fast. Another example, during the pandemic, many movements restructured, and they couldn't restructure fast enough because the by-consent model that they organize, in contrast to the Occupy movement, the model, they call it, of the Occupy movement. So they did another organization called by consent, where you have to say why this action is going to harm the movement. If you don't, if no one is persuaded you adhere with the principles of the movement, you can go ahead with the action. This has been a problem for Extinction Rebellion because, for example, although there were disagreements, an action sticking on the underground in London on the trains, sticking themselves, and all that was seen as not respecting the working class people going to work and so on. Extinction Rebellion was also, you're a global north elite movement, middle class movement, and so on. And Roger Hammer himself said to me in the interview that the movement I helped create is taken over by kind of like this elite global north, whatever. So the decentralized leadership question is also being criticized as a rhetorical strategy, an empty signifier. For example, Snyder writes about this, that it's often used to unify diverse participants, right? So that it is actually this decentralization an aspiration, a performative aspiration, a framing, and that actually in practice, Snyder argues, decentralized systems lack the means to course correct, control emergent power blocks, or hold leaders accountable. Another fantastic theory, Dolata, writes that participants are often well-educated, dissatisfied, tech-savvy, and skeptical of this organization. However, that these claims that participants are well-educated, given transformations in higher education, he suggests that participants are ignorant of classic forms of organizing, and that their non-hierarchical vision, the horizontal vision, it's actually ideological, completely ideological. By the 2010s, there was a growing concern that this leaderlessness could mask power structures, and there were calls to analyze the mechanisms of power through which particular discursive rhythms of truth produce and naturalize hierarchies and the political inequalities that flow from them. I'm quoting from Martin and Zara Cole in 2016, and so on. And in relation to any surviving in the 2010s, autonomous movements have often evolved in the direction of reactive movements or alienation. And then we get to the point that, in terms of digital activism in particular, theories like Tufekci, for example, argues that when you have flash in the pan mobilizations that happen online, flash in the pan, like they happen, they don't sustain themselves, you have this issue of you have acceleration of the mobilization. So what took, with the Vietnam 4 years to organize, or what took with the anti-Iraq war mobilization 6 months, without the Trump protests, with the pink hats and the things, that mobilization happened in 48 hours. So you can see this acceleration of mobilization on the other hand, but the network, the movement internalities of how you organize the movement and you build the movement is basically a problem, because these network internalities means that are neglected. You can lead to movements that scale up, but they miss essential pillars of support. In fact, Tufekci beautifully puts, he says, they are hitting dangerous curves while traveling at top speed without the ability to adapt course. So this is all happening online very fast, and through this participatory leaderlessness, horizontalism, yes, they are a source of strength, but also it's a treacherous path over the long haul, because then these movements face a tactical freeze, and they lack mechanisms for making decisions in the face of disagreements. No one with the ability to nudge the movement, see rise towards new tactics, together with the danger of de facto leadership. So this lack of, at the same time, lack of institutionalized leadership might be a good thing, because you have space for taking initiatives. In the case of Greece and Spain, of course, we have the exception because of the tactical freeze, because these groups broke from the movement, started political parties. You all know this story, as we are here in Athens. Now, I'm not going to go to the point about orders of descent, but just to say that unless the ideological production is actually operating above the point of the critique, it means that it is not of a higher order, basically, right? It means that you have this freeze because the ideological order does not surpass capitalism or variety of it as a social code. So you have a movement that actually does not succeed or does not. So this is the point of the order of descent. Now, the beautiful thing is like how this happens is always mediated by labor processes. I think the most sort of useful, perhaps most recent theorization of this is biolabour, the biolabour process by Morini and Fumagalli, who talk about certain characteristics of this biolabour process, and how they describe it is that you have a process where the separation between working time and lifetime is overcome, separation between working place and life place is overcome, separation between production and reproduction is overcome, the separation among production, reproduction, circulation, consumption are overcome. So you have like a digital labor theory that is a little bit more superficial because people look at gig work and like exploitation or whatever, but this is a more sophisticated way of describing this new, like, let's say, rejuvenated the labor theory of value and remodulated rethought and so on. Now, the alternative temporalities question, going back to the temporality problem, and producing alternative temporalities by contemporary sociopolitical movements, tends to hold, sadly, I would say, more structural effectivity for connecting to the masses when it emerges from the far-right ideological repertoire rather from a radical left. So while you have this long-standing assumption that this is because the left is in perpetual disunity, fragmented, recuperated, with no feasible vision for a new system to replace capitalism, right? This logic lies because the left is disunited, whatever. It does not take into account the significance of temporal practices, particularly those related to digital bureaucracies, network internalities and externalities of movement organization, governance and polarization of algorithmic time by platforms themselves. And these platforms themselves are in the business of enterprise association, not civil association as such. They're not built to bring anybody democracy. So you need them kind of debating or individually expressing your opinion, you're thinking, you're participating. No, yeah, they were not built for that. Okay? So you're hitting there the wall of algorithmic governance. So if you look at several empirical examples of left radicalism's organizational, communicative, internal contradictions, the argument here I want to make is that this obsession with decentralized and diffuse movement leadership and organization is incompatible with demands of algorithmic time on the platforms that are used for mobilization and protest, organization, and they basically fail to intervene in ways that are structurally effective. And therefore, they hold limited potential to produce future temporalities which surpass the organization of human life beyond capitalism. And the struggle is about producing alternative temporalities. And the reason they're hitting the wall of platform capitalism is because internal and external organization and communication dynamics, right, they have to be rethought and understood in relation to how the ideologization process has been transformed, the leadership itself has been transformed. And the argument we're making in the book with Jacob Matthews is that you have a fractalization of leadership, and by this term we point to this leadership construction that intensifies due to algorithmic-based flows of information and viral affectivity. So you have new forms of leadership that are marked by their highly volatile nature, both in terms of public mass following, sudden passage from local and inter-individual level to worldwide live mass celebrity, and so on and so forth. So ultimately, and I'm going to finish this, the digital networks, and I describe what I think about them. I'm just using the term for convenience here. Digital networks impede the ideologization process, and they proliferate this planted ideological production, accelerating surveillance, capital, rejecting the dialectic. They produce false consciousness, like their life depends on it. Their enterprise life depends on it. They do that because their life as in life, making profit, actually does, because it does depend on it. So this is it from me, and thank you very much.
So, thank you, Athina, for your interesting talk. Now the floor is open. So, who would like to ask something? But if you want to ask something, you should take the microphone. Ask freely questions.
Okay, I would like to.
Can we have the microphone, please? It is for the recording.
Okay. Yeah, I get it. Well, it's not exactly a question, it's a constatation mostly, but I want your opinion as well. You mentioned, especially at the second part of your talk, the algorithmic governance. Regarding the algorithmic governance, there is a huge misunderstanding, especially to those people that they are not so much concerned regarding algorithms, in the sense that they consider algorithm a pure product of mathematics, so something that is neutral. In reality, there is no such substance of neutrality in an algorithm. On the contrary, what we face in what you mentioned as platform capitalism, especially in the social media, is algorithms that they are working for the favor mostly of alt-right. So this is the constatation. My question is, if you deal with algorithms that they are produced and more produced, and I don't know, I don't want to guess, but I think that with AI this is going to be multiplied to I don't know where, skyrocket. How a movement can put even the questions about hierarchy or non-hierarchy, horizontality or verticality into the frame context of algorithms that they are working already for a boss. And by boss, I mean an ideological boss, not the boss that is Zuckerberg or whoever, Elon Musk, but an ideology that is on the top of the algorithm and controls the production, controls the dissemination and distribution, and collects the data. How this can happen? That's it. Maybe it's naive, but...
This is the $1 billion question, Ilya. or trillion in the case of Elon Musk, I don't know. Okay, I can tell you how it will not happen, and then maybe you can think about how it might happen. How it will not happen is if this techno-utopian story, which is not just that digital media will bring democracy and all that. I think we all now, especially since 2018 in particular, but also 2013 Snowden, WikiLeaks before that, Cambridge Analytica scandal 2018, we have, I think, even the last person, I think, has understood that is not bringing the democracy or whatever. And we could, I can tell you, a lot about Arab Spring and how, this overhype about social media, where you had structural conditions in these countries that were neoliberal structural adjustment, all this kind of stuff going on. So it was never, that, and with mainstream media actually playing a major role at that point already in 2011, 2012. So I think people, of course, in the public debate and public opinion understands that it hasn't brought, the initial optimism has gone down the drain. On the other hand, the alternatives that have been proposed, particularly in terms of commons-oriented, pro-communes in Barcelona, all this optimism about horizontal, leaderless story, I think it is also problematic. There's this black and white. You're either going to be vertical or horizontal. This is a very problematic position to take. Or that, oh, we can have commons-oriented, so the product can be used by the public. Example, Goteo. We have talked a lot together about this as well. And then you have this platform cooperativism, where you say, oh, you have this ecology of transforming capitalism, because you have this cooperative style, more democratic, participatory model, the worker zones, that, and a digital version of that. You have like an ecosystem of cooperatives that is built, and then this is scaled and so on. Now, these alternatives have gone nowhere. Okay, and you can have, and this is why I talked about this naivety. I don't know if I said it inside my head or outside, but you have this naivety of scholars here in Greece as well, right? Yeah, with the micro movements. Yeah, well, I want to laugh as well and cry. The micro movements, right, and the these micro movements and the and how this cooperative here and there is doing that, and we should all get inspired. But the problem here with this is scaling, yeah, is scaling, and also that ultimately you cannot talk about your vision and changing the world through changing how these platforms work, creating new alternative journalism, alternative platforms, and whatever. But the reality is that unless you have a lot of people on a network, you don't have a social media thing happening. It's about how many people. An example I will give: an Uber public policy person that was representing Uber for the Iberic Peninsula. We interviewed him, and he said, well, if they're on the network, we need to, that's it. We have them on the network, right? Or Airbnb will tell you, we want this experience. So the fabric of, like, you get to the platform, the whole experience of the city we offer you. So there's the fabric of the whole experience. That's why you have a zombie capitalism or hyper-capitalism kind of story happening. So against that, right, what are you posing, right? What are you posing? What is the alternative in terms of organization? I'm not talking about ideological production, right? I'm talking about the actual structural effectivity, right? So because the idea is that you can talk about a lot of things, but there is a reality, and whether what you're proposing alternative is actually transforming the labor process, whatever, right? All that. So you have the issue is that, in a way, these mediating managers of platforms, or those also that are the precarious workers and gig workers in these platforms as well. You have the managers that are thinking that they're supposedly changing the world in some way because you have this alternative, this and that, but the reality is that they don't. They talk about it, and because they're hostage. And the beautiful example, of course, is that when you try to work with Coteo, you had that issue of, what was it called? The one that you couldn't send money because of the Greek crisis. I can't remember what it was called. So
because of the politics of
exactly,
the state
exactly.
period.
At the time, yes, a state problem. But that means that the traditional institutions cannot be overcome, right? So all this fantasy about, oh, we're going to have the blockchain, and the blockchain, right, it's going to democratize, it's going to get rid of the mediators. So let's say there is the vision. For me, the problem is not the vision. We can have many wonderful visions. Is that how do you materialize so you can have effectivity in actual processes, the biolabour process, organization, governance, and so on. So that is, for me, the problem. So you're not going to do it through that, through the alternative, talking about the alternative, or even doing it in a small scale. I did this project there, in that village, and it was good, and I helped the people. That is good, but so we have this problem here, that this is too kind of like too global and too. The other, about the black and white, horizontal and hierarchical, is couldn't you have an alternating mode of leadership where for some things you can have the horizontal participatory kind of story, right? And for some other things that need centralized leadership, you can have centralized leadership. Why has it has to be like this plague that, because we're horizontal, we are morally good, ethically and politically. So this is the thing. But I don't know if it helps in any way. I mean, but that's what I think. Corina.
Can we have a microphone
Ah.
over there?
Totally agree. So the ethics of being non-horizontal and being rogue and bankrupt in a non-globalized world where ethnicities and nationalism is on the rise, rogue states on the rise, doesn't actually do robots, which is what I'm, so to help the question, robots are not national things. Robots actually speak very specific languages, very global ones. They speak, actually, you can help me here. They speak very specific, to put it that way, robots actually speak American English. They speak a lot of Arabic, a lot of Russian, and some Chinese. And they're very different robots. So to help you in a good way. So there's a fractal leadership, which is very important. That doesn't speak to robots. It doesn't. On the contrary, it's actually people that already know states are bankrupt. So the question is actually much more simple, in a very good way. If resistance in a post-rogue, post-globalized way is already rogue, is already fractal, the question is very simple and beautiful. Do you think, in a good way, do you think we're gonna do well now? Do you feel that every single thing that you've actually wrote about in the last 6 years of your life, which is about the opposite of what he said, you write about non-globalized, very fractal leaderships. Do you think they're now empowered and then actually do something?
Okay. What I haven't thought about deeply yet is whether this fractalization of leadership only has negative effects. Yeah, so this is the problem, that if you say this fractalization of leadership has negative effects only, which is that you have an authoritarian turn, a populist turn, and also, if you say populist turn, it means that we want a central neoliberal thing to continue, not to go populist, right? So you already said, like, oh, we like the central thing, right? Like, thank you, Macron, you're doing well, thank you very much. If you say authoritarian turn, that again is a problem, because you could say authoritarian in what sense? Because, I mean, you have the problem, authoritarian in what way? In the sense that you have China, for instance, it's another thing going on there, and how people are resisting the Chinese regime is vast. Dissent is vast in China, vast. And what does this authoritarian mean? Of course, in political theory, you have the totalitarian communist regime, you know, and then you have the authoritarian one that might be Latin America. You have these problems. But besides the scholarly debate about this, if I say that this fractalization is only negative, right, then this is not dialectical. at all. So you have like this dialectical thing where you say, oh, it's just like bad, bad, bad. The platforms are bad. Also, then it becomes the robots are bad. ChatGPT, our friend, wants me to divorce my wife and all that. Then, so how would you explain, if you say that, how would you explain what's happening in Iran? Or, you know, in other places where you might have the state terminating movements, right? But at the same time, this descent connects globally through this fractalize and goes very, very fast. The question becomes, could you say, for example, that Greta Thunberg, for instance, is she an actual movement leader? Or is she a celebrity, whatever, like manufactured robot? Yeah. I have a lot of sympathy for her, especially because she gets angry and they cannot control it. Yes, I love that. But what I'm saying is like, so you have what could be, let's say, change in the world, right? And in an active desire for change, and not a reactive one that is close, fixed identities. This is my nation, this is yours. Like the nationalism of Duterte, Modi, you know, Orban or whoever else, right? Trump, and all. Like, so this is a great question, and I don't know, but I think what can become very interesting is that this rapid fractalization going up and down, and the way it's happening, could potentially create organizational models beyond this horizontal and the hierarchical story that we've been talking about for 30 years or more, to something that is actually constructive in movement organization that is effective in changing the world, right? The reason Rosa Luxemburg, therefore, to put it back is interesting is because this inaction thing and the traces it leaves, in that sense, the spontaneity of it, how could you turn that in long-term sustained action without being hostage, literally hostage, or collateral damage? So the people that you're supposed to be helping, they become collateral damage. Like in that sense, how you could have that to not happen, or that it doesn't become a didentarian, or it doesn't. So how? And I think the Rosa Luxemburg idea is that actually you can have the movement in action spontaneity without the leaders directing the movement at the same time, in that sense of this top-down thing. At the same time, I think that the failure of reconciling the Leninist and the Luxemburg kind of idea, that was a failure of synthesis there for obvious reasons that were basically, I don't know, chicken said politics, I don't know what it was, right? That there was no reconciliation, and an effort was made. The effort, I think, was made in a way, I think, by Lukács or whatever. So I think if you go to the traditional debate, why can't you have this synthesis where you have both a direction or emerging direction to sustain, but the movement is in flux and it leaves its traces, and the political consciousness actually emerges from the movement, but is sustained by a movement organization that is not just horizontal or hierarchical. This is where I think we might be getting somewhere there. I don't know. About the robots, the robots are having more fun than us. They write the poetry, they're painting now, they're doing all sorts of things. It's just that we're not having as much fun at the moment.
Who else want to ask something? Anyone else? So.
The way you said it, you remind me of a journalist once in some kind of story, and I think he was saying he wanted to ask this. He's like, "What about hackers?" He was asking me like, "What about this?" The way you said it, who was to ask something?
Yeah.
Athina, I was very interested by what you said about, you know, how do we scale up? And it seems to me like perhaps the digital world is is possibly or could become one of the ways to scale up. I don't know. What do you think about that by its own nature? I mean, and then my other question is that when you were talking about follow up by your question, you know, if the ideological, let's say, the ideological bosses already determine the whole field, how is it possible to escape from that? How is it possible to function within that? So these are two different questions, but how do you overcome a condition when that, you know, ideologically is already determined?
Not by scaling up, probably. so yeah. So I mean, because if your ambition is of the same, and this is where it was going, I was going on about that. If the ideological production is within the logic of the social code. Baudrillard wrote about beautiful. I mean, capitalism as a social code, right? So if you're like pitching, basically, to put it simply, the ideological order is within that that social code. Let's scale up. Let's say, like, you know, we have the digital now, solutionism. You know, this techno solutionism that is going on. If it doesn't surpass that ideological order, it is going nowhere. This is the point, because you're within that confined, both in terms of ideological production, but then by default in terms of structural effectivity of your ideological production. So I wouldn't say that you know, like the post-Fordist model and whatever, let's apply this to social movements and scale up the projects, and then we'll arrive at this kind of solution, especially because that kind of scaling up logic does not tend to account that we have, like, you know, 30 years to live. There's an ecological disaster here, right? At the same time. So, okay, you can scale up to do what exactly, right? To create more ecological catastrophe, I don't know, but in a democratic way. Right? So
yeah, I agree with you.
So do it in a democratic way, but we're going to continue to end the world. Do you see?
I see what you're saying. So scaling up is not a solution, but what is a possible way forward? If scaling up is not, and I agree with you that scaling up, like, you know, you mentioned the ecological crisis. You know, recycle hasn't led anywhere.
Sorry, can I help? Can you talk about syphilis and scaling? Syphilis, Rosa, and scaling, please. Syphilis, Rosa, and scaling.
We have to explain, though, before you do that. Before you do that, because people are not understand the syphilis comment. Hold on, yeah. Let's explain the syphilis before we go anywhere else.
I never knew about syphilis. She
Yeah.
talked about syphilis and Rosa. I didn't.
Yeah, like so Rosa, because of the tensions and conflicts and the effort to impose some kind of specific perspective on Rosa Luxemburg's legacy, a person in the KPD, which was the party, the Communist Party that came through Spartacus, which was the organization she led with Liebknecht. Ruth Fisher, inside that, called her a syphilis baculus, like he actually of the workers' movement. So Ruth Fisher inside the KPD, and this is where Lenin intervened and said, "No, Rosa is Rosa was an eagle." Like, so the comment about syphilis about that she was characterized, syphilis, baculus, by her own comrades. So just to explain this for people, because the way you said it, it was right. It's a bit kind of what is this, but that exists. So what was your comment about that?
Go to where radicalism, what you asked, is about how can you scale. You cannot scale syphilis. You cannot scale.
Oh yeah, I think they probably could because you had a pandemic that scaled fairly quickly and killing millions of people. So, but I think her question. Okay, hold on. Yeah. So hold on. So the question. Okay. So okay, perhaps the question about scaling is that for me the problem is that there is no dialectic there is no dialectic in the story, that we either have this model that says horizontal, participatory, open, whatever else,
And
right?
ill.
and then have the centralized leadership party situation. One, and the second, we cannot have that. You have to have an interchange, because the way you govern, you have to be changing modalities to govern. You cannot actually react to things by saying my dogma is this and then my dogma is that. I'm not saying that you should be relative or a relativist either. But you have to be like this. The other problem is that there is an argument made that the right is funded a lot more, right? You know, like the Cohen brothers, I mean, in every country, right? And this is why the left is losing the battle. And I think this is not true, necessarily. It is not true. In the sense that there is money going to the left as well, and in particular the last 15 years, you see that there's money, funding going to the left. But it's not that the left is divided, therefore, even when they get the money, they cannot organize together, or like the leadership does not emerge in a way that is effective. I don't think, or they don't have enough strong digital bureaucracy. This is why you see the far right is more successful, and so on. I think that in a way it's more complex than that. That is not that we don't have enough money, we don't have any digital bureaucracies, we don't have a coalition building that is effective and people fight each other, intra-fighting. I don't think it is that. I don't think that it is only the ideological problem or the organizational problem, or how do you... I think it's in fear of appearing, how can I say, banal, that there is a combination of stories here, right? A matrix of stories happening here. Now, how do you decide what modes of organizing, what modalities of leadership, what you do about that? It comes to the triangle, the ménage à trois, right? To go about syphilis, go back to syphilis. The ménage à trois, what is it? Corporate, government, civil society, and how civil society, right, is funded by corporate and government. Civil society is there to fill in the gaps that the government cannot fill, and it's taking money from both things. You have a triangle there of very exclusive global trusted networks, especially in relation to the digital, right, and to how the digital actually operates in terms of the platform economics of it, and so on. I don't know if I'm making sense, but in that triangle, the citizen, of course, feels empowered, and, well, you know, if I don't learn to hack here, like, I'm not gonna do it, or, you know, like, if yeah. So it's this hack or be hacked scenario. We made a bit of a little joke of a paper once for new formations that was about this hack or be hacked scenario, because you have these very close global trusted networks, and there are corporate, government, civil society together. Right? It has nothing to do with citizenship, citizens voting. So that digital planning, also at the global level or in other levels, does not include the citizen, because it's not built for a citizen. Obviously, it's built for a consumer that just want you to buy the stuff, right? And then they wake up one day and they say, oh, you know, this Zuckerberg saying to the Senate in the United States, but I'm selling ads, Senator, right? Like, why are you asking me? I'm just here selling my ads. Like, that's no longer acceptable. That's why you have these efforts about this citizenship. I was part of some of those as well. What does this citizenship mean for the European Commission, for example? it means, and for policy makers, it means, oh, we have to have more access and competencies, for example. And it's about regulating what already, right, has happened. Yeah, the same. Give the thing, yeah, exactly. So, yeah, like cure the syphilis, that's it. Cure the syphilis, exactly. And it's a great analogy. Yeah, so I think that logic is anti-dialectical, to put it mildly, and that doesn't get us anywhere. That's the other thing. I mean, I don't mind if we spend the next 20 years talking about access and competencies, digital access and digital competencies, and becoming inclusive and bridging the digital gap. But you can keep doing that, but I mean, okay, throw a few more millions to do that and get the same answer, keep getting the same. We need to regulate this, we need to regulate. I mean, I don't know. What is the actual point in terms of having an approach that is not about individuals look individually about their own well-being and negotiating in me with my line manager or whatever, right? This is like individual. The problem is there, the people now, and of course, this goes back not just to neoliberalism, about the individual subjectivity that is going to have to adapt, right? Become a flexible worker, and like, you know, you throw them stuff and they're resilient. Well, let's have resilience, right? Be resilient. Exactly, it's the syphilis problem, right? And then, so you have, you become resilient. What does it mean that the life throws stuff at you and you keep going, right? That's the idea. Until one day, nothing is going and a lot of people die or whatever, right? Yeah.
Can we get the microphone over there, please?
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. May I ask, isn't a prior, a kind more a question we have to ask before going into, you know, fractalization, non-hierarchical organization, rhizomatics, so on? At what level do we consider the digital spectrum to operate? I mean, if we go back to, in other words, is it just a means for organizing? It's a way of organizing, of doing things, and we're asking questions how to do. I mean, is it working that way or the other way? But isn't there a preliminary question, a kind of more fundamental question, which is who is organizing and to what purpose? Who is, you know, the agent behind all that? It's just a question of how we do it, but who is doing what? And what do we want to do?
And why?
If we go back to, say, Luxemburg, I mean, the great thinkers, revolutionaries of the early 20th century, they were utterly convinced that there was a flow of history. I mean, you can, especially Luxemburg, he sees the movement. I mean, political organizations sees political organization as assisting the existing flow of history. We just go with the flow. We have to help the flow. I mean, this is also Lenin's idea. I mean, there is a direction of historical development. We somehow go with the flow. And this is the positive, this is the revolutionary, this is going towards something better. But now, we're not that sure anymore. And this is operating at a deeper level. This is the level of classes, this is the material level, and so on. But now we're not that confident. And so before asking about, let's say, technicalities, shouldn't we ask who is doing what and for what purpose? And, for example, and whether this kind of digitalization does impact the level, the deeper level classical Marxism refers to, that creates subjectivity, say, at a level where classes would be were originally thought to operate on?
So I'm not sure about this. Sorry, in the sense that okay, so the history and what you're talking about, it's the Hegelian, right, story. I think that Marx, for example, himself, because if you look at who they were getting the inspiration, right, it was not Hegel directly ever. It was Marx and Engels. That was the inspiration for these revolutionaries, and you had the let's say the attack on Luxemburgism in particular, or to be an equivalent of Trotskyism, for example, right, against Leninism. I mean, that attack as a whole doctrine that happened during Stalin's time, Stalin had as a political necessity to attack Luxemburgism and Trotskyism. Obviously, it was a political necessity then. But how you talk about the flow and go to the flow, I mean, I'm not sure in the sense that even Marx, I don't think that he was although he was a young Hegelian, he was influenced, of course, but I don't think that, I think he moved on in critique of Hegel, that it wasn't, how can I put it, I'm not sure that what you're saying was ever true in the Marxist tradition. So to say that, oh, now we're flowing before, with this 100 years ago, the history, we thought they were flowing inside the history, you know, and all that. I'm not sure that people thought that even 100 years ago in that sense that you are describing it. It doesn't make sense. I mean, at least the Marxist tradition, that these other doctrines, or they were kind of attacked as doctrines, even if they originally weren't, like Luxemburgism, for example, right? So I'm not sure that how you're describing it was actually understood like that 100 years ago, and now suddenly we're not going with the flow anymore because, I don't know, we changed our minds. I mean, I don't know, right? So I'm not being disruptive. I'm just trying to think through what you're saying. I think it is something, I mean, as a problematic of where it kind of evolved, let's say if you have a more kind of Foucauldian analysis of the terminology, archaeology, the analogy, or whatever, if you could say that 100 years ago they thought in a purely Hegelian way, if Marx and Engels had already left a legacy, I mean, they were 70 years after Marx, so the immediate influence was Marx. It was not Hegel. No, I mean, no, but for the revolutionaries you're describing 100 years ago, their influence was Marx, because for them it was 70 years away. It was not Hegel. For Marx, it might have been Hegel, but he critiqued Hegel. Does it make any sense? But I'm not sure about whether it is true, what you're saying. I have to think about it more. I don't know. I don't want to go with the flow. I don't want to go with the flow at all. Yeah. So I think going with the flow is a bad idea. That's what I'm trying to say. Like, and viewing history. So the Hegelian idea is that you have like a history happening, and then there's an individual happen in the middle, and then history changes, right? So you have like history is happening, Napoleon comes, right? And then it changes. This makes sense. So you have like that view. I don't think we have that view now. And going back to leadership and the fractalization of leadership, it means that you don't have this charismatic one person that is there changing the course of history. I don't think you have that anymore. And I don't think it's bad that we don't have that anymore.
Can I help the question?
Sure.
I think that what he meant, many people want history to not end. Many people, when they talk about flow, they're not talking about Hegel about.
You mean Fukuyama, the classic? Well, he changed his mind.
Actually, so if I can help, sorry, we'll recast the question in a good way. I think the question is, given that life still exists, and whether we like it or not, it is not in some Hegelian dialectic process where history is actually working, and it's not in a Marxist process where class struggle is working. I think what he's asking is, sorry, I'm doing that. Sorry, I'm doing that. What he's saying is, given that you have this amazing way of understanding fractal leadership, something that's going on, that's happening, how does that relate to old party form dialectics and the way in which history and life was actually determined towards the future? I think that's what you're asking, no?
Well, I mean,
you've been studying social movements
yeah.
as fractal leadership, as something that actually bring the future. You've been studying loads of movements all your life, but how the future's here, how the present is the future, without the party form, without Rosa. And I think that's the flow that he's talking about.
Okay. Okay. I don't know.
But you think it's a good future,
No, I mean, my effort,
that's the question, no?
so my effort here is to show that you know, because there is and you know, I also wrote about it, I don't know, 20 years ago or more in my doctoral thesis. I said, well, power, participation, democracy, which are modernist, you know, modernist flows, yes, these movements want these modernist things, right? They want this power, participation, democracy. That's what they also want. So what is the difference here? And I think the difference here is that they want this modernist demands in a postmodern medium. Now, okay, and by postmodern, of course, we were discussing this 20 years ago, postmodern not in terms of art, postmodern or whatever, but that the internet, as we used to talk about it, was talked about as a tool or use and whatever, but actually the postmodern idea was about the internet being a space, and now, of course, it's a multiple space, and also simulation space, is that we were moving beyond representation. This is how you represent, woman is represented, black is represented, Asian is represented, the subalterns, whatever. To simulation. And we're discussing this difference and what this difference means. Now, okay, this is difficult. Now, right, can you see that whether these modernist aims have changed? Do people want perhaps other things? It is interesting. For instance, a 17-year-old Extinction Rebellion youth activist that I interviewed, right? He told me, well, I'm in Extinction Rebellion youth because, you know, the Friday strikes, they were not effective, and I thought all these guys with the civil disobedience, you know, they're going to do more, they're more radical, so I'm going to join Extinction Rebellion youth, and he was 17. And they said to me, but you know what, I had to leave the Tory party, the Conservative Party, I had to leave, not be a member. I was like, what do you mean? So you were, I said, you were in the Conservative Tory party? That's in the UK. Okay, tell me about that. Why did you leave? Because of the anti-protest law. Right. Now, ideologically, it's in a way a meta moment, because you have a 70-year-old like teenager that says, I'm conservative about some things, but I am radical about other things. And the environment in that generation, because of the climate anxiety, you know, the world is ending, and look at it, you know, our generation. And of course, and we discussed this together, Corinna, before, there is a problem when everything becomes about generational stuff. My generation, the millennials, they're the snowflakes, you know, they're buying too many avocado toast, they can't buy a house because they spend all the money on the avocado toast. You know, so you have like this generational thing, and the generational thing can be helpful in some ways because you have this mentoring. For example, we've seen mentoring from Black Lives Matter of very young activists that were doing great on social media, but they couldn't arrange with the council authorities to do a physical protest. They needed mentoring from anti-racist organizations that have been there for 40 years to organize a physical protest during COVID, to get permission, to organize the things on the ground. You know, they had to be mediated, so to speak. So although they could get the people out where? They could get the people to follow them because they were online and were doing their catching the moment of Black Lives Matter in June 2020, or the Estonia kids that had no significant black population in the country, they had ethnic Russians. Well, this, I don't want to go near that because I think it's too early for, I don't know. Yeah. So anyway, I'm just saying, like, the example of this fractalization is that you have my Estonian colleague, Katri Tideberg, was saying it's very strange because why are they mobilizing for Black Lives Matter? So it's like a, you know, this fractalization going up and down like a yo-yo means that you will have mobilizations that are not connected to actual political culture of their own country. Otherwise, if they were so, I don't know, like politically, I don't know, concerned, they've never mobilized for ethnic Russians or there's many more in their country or what. You see what I mean? So you have like this trending, right? And for that kid that was Tory and left the Tory party in Extinction Rebellion, you can see there's a broad church spectrum, the conservationists, right-wing people in there, and whatever. For every one kid like that, you have another kid that his whole family and him are going to go to the People's March in London against Brexit. And they're going to connect with the Labour Party, the family, they're going to be... Right. The problem is about and Ziber makes that point, and that's why I gave you some things so we can bring them back. When Ziber says this thing about that it's about the individual and not the collective anymore, in the Belarusian protest during the pandemic, in Belarus, right, there were protests there. The research showed that 60% of the people going to the protest against the government went as an individual person, not as a movement, not done whatever. So I'm wondering, I've heard the same, I think we're discussing it with George, the people that went for the protest here in Athens, some people went individually, like just on their own. They were not part of PAME or like other traditional political organizations, party organizations. So that's very interesting because if you have the digital movement, you're participating in the digital materialization, right? But then how do you go to it? Then you have to join. Are you going as an individual? I mean, what is happening? Are people individually self-expressing? The individual saying, no, I'm going to go, right? I'm going to go on my own. Right. What does this mean? So anyway, I don't know if we got anywhere with this at all. Yeah, I don't know if we went.
Maybe they are not individual, but individual.
Yeah. Not then we get to the Simondon. Okay.
So thank you for your attendance in today. Thank you, Athina, for your talk, for the discussion. So in 14 days from now, our next speaker will be Volodymyr Senko, and will speak on the war in Ukraine. So thank you, everyone, and have a good night.
You don't.